Next on our agenda, going to be hearing from Thomas Hicks, who is an EAC Commissioner, Election Assistance Commission. We are very fortunate to have him here today. So Thomas Hicks was confirmed by unanimous consent of the United States Senate on December 16th. I feel like I'm blocking you. I'm here. December 16th, 2014, to serve on the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, or EAC. Prior to his appointment with the EAC, he served on the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on House Administration from 2003 to 2014. He recently completed the Election Center and Auburn University's Certified Elections Registration Administrator program. Yep. He received his JD from Catholic University of America, Columbus School of Law, and his BA in Government from Clark University, and if I may ad-lib a little bit, just very respected in the field, very generous with his time and his expertise. Many of us know him here, and we greatly, again, appreciate him joining us today, and looking forward to his remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Romero, for inviting me to speak here today. And before I get started, I really enjoyed the last panel, but something that was said really troubled me. And if I get her name wrong, I'm apologizing now. I think it was Janet Hernandez, who said that her mother had a hard time voting because of her nephew or brother or whatever coming to help her. And I want to make it clear that if someone needs assistance at the polls, they are entitled to that assistance at the polls. The EAC has done a fantastic job with disability rights and disability access. And along with my fellow commissioners at the time, McCormick and Matt Masterson, we came up with, and I pushed for it, we came up with a disability access card that we provide to the disabled community as much as possible. And what I do now, and so I took basically my purse out to show this because it's actually legit, is that I actually carry a card around with me. And that card says what your federal voting rights are. And so it's done in Braille, it's done in large print, and it's for the disabled community, but it could be used for anyone because these rights apply to everyone. You have a right to vote independently and privately. Vote in an accessible polling place for voters with disabilities. You may ask your local election official to tell you about your voting aids, voting assistance, and mail and absentee ballot procedures that are available. As a voter with disability, you may either seek assistance from workers at the polls who have been trained to use the machines, or you may bring someone to help you. And this is the same for language minorities as well. So it's on our website, but if you would like copies, we can also give those to you. So that's my public service announcement for today. But that's not why Mindy invited me here today. She invited me to educate folks on what the EAC is. And so I'm going to do my best not to read rhyme remarks, but I have to read them because Kristen will get mad at me for the work that she's done in helping me prepare these remarks over the weekend. So I'm going to try to stay on script, but obviously already I'm off script. So again, it's an honor to be here today with all of you. I'm Tom Hicks, Commissioner with the EAC. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the EAC, we're a small, independent, bipartisan commission and the only federal agency solely focused on administration of elections. Our mission is to help election officials improve the administration of elections and help Americans participate in the voting process. And I will say that although it's two from each main political party, 95% of this stuff is nonpartisan, and we basically agree on 96, 95, 94% of it. The 5% or so that we have to argue with to be able to keep our good government jobs, we do in a respectable way as much as we can. Because some of this stuff has become more partisan in the last few years or so. But we ensure election officials have the guidance, research, and resources to administer fair, accurate, and secure elections, and that's part of being at the EAC. So many folks And I know that there was at least one person here today have never heard of the Election Assistance Commission, and that's okay. That's part of the way that I've been able to keep my job for so long, is because people don't know about it, and so they don't want to come and take it away from us. So the Help America Vote Act of 2002, or HAVA, established the EAC after the 2000 presidential election. HAVA also made sweeping reforms to the voting process. This includes serving as a clearinghouse of election administration information and producing biannual reports, the Election Administrating and Voting Survey, or EVES, which Sean Green helped to do on many occasions within his time at the EAC. The data we collect for the EVES is directly from election offices. So it's not something we've made up. We go to election officials and they transfer that up to their state offices, and we get that, and it's done on a biannual basis. It offers the nation's most comprehensive research on election administration and voting, and what I like to call the census of election administration and voting trends. This provides valuable insight to election officials, lawmakers, academics, and the public on how America votes. And I'm trying my best to be under the light and sit up, because I know that if my mother sees this and I'm hunched over, she's going to make comments about it. Not that she watches me on TV or anything, or the TikTok, as people were saying earlier. But the EVES for the 2022 midterms was released this past June. It is available on our website. And I want you to keep in mind to watch out for the 2024 EVES, which will be released in the summer of 2025. Additionally, the agency develops voluntary voting system guidelines, which tests, certifies voting systems, develops guidance that meets HAVA's requirements for states in key areas, including security and accessibility, which we've heard so much about in the last 4 or 5 years. And we administer HAVA funding to the states to meet these new standards. HAVA was the first time it was written in federal law that voters with disabilities should have the same opportunities for access and participation, including privacy and independence. Other federal laws include the Voting Rights Act, aimed to strengthen our democracy by ensuring that all eligible Americans can register to vote and have their votes and ballots counted. So why am I here today? It might sound a little trite, but we can all agree that our democracy, as was said on the first panel, is stronger when more participation by people who have their votes heard. However, as we all know, this is a lot easier said than done, and we have a lot more work to be done to include that. So what does it mean to have an inclusive democracy? And what will it take to achieve that? This is something that I've worked on for my entire career in government. And in my years as a EAC commissioner, I've met thousands of election officials, administrators, staff, and citizens at various conferences and meetings. And despite the increased polarization of elections in recent years, by far, all are committed to upholding public confidence and the integrity of elections. And I would say by far. I was down in Louisiana last week for a conference, and wherever I go, it's the same thing that's been said. I've gone to all 50 states, and I only have one more territory to go to before I can cross that off of seeing all the states and territories. But wherever I go, they say, when I talk to citizens, they'll say, our elections are fine. Joan, Jane, Paul, whoever is running their elections is doing a fantastic job. It's that state over there that we are having concerns with because they do things this way or do things that way. And I would say that it's the same sort of goal of making sure that everyone who's eligible to vote can cast their votes and have those votes counted. And the bad thing that I've seen in the last few years is that that's been expanded out in terms of the questioning of people who are living overseas. And who are the people who are living overseas? It's usually our military and other folks who are doing that in their families. So for folks to now turn that question of why are we allowing people to vote from overseas is going to be an interesting issue that I see coming down the pike in the next few years or so. But again, sorry, Kristen, I'm diverting from what you've written here. What we've written here. So the biggest priorities are to run a smooth election, ensure that all eligible voters who wish to cast their votes can give confidence in that is accurate. And so one of the top issues my fellow commissioners and I have had in our conversations across the country, and I would say that this is by far something that people keep talking about, is funding. How do we fund our elections? Is there a dedicated funding stream that comes about? We have these potholes here. We can't buy new voting equipment and have potholes. Or for a politician to say, hey, I can't just pose next to a voting machine, but I can stand next to a fire engine and then have that put up to show that I'm giving back to the community. So funding and investment in the election infrastructure significantly contributes to the voting access and overall experience of voters. And I will say that Congress has stepped up in the last few years and given us close to $1 billion in the last 4 years to pass out to the states, either under CARES funding or security funding for new voting equipment or new security features for that. And that sounds like a lot when you say $1 billion, but when you divide that by the 50 states and the 5 territories in D.C. over 4 years, that does not come out to be that much when we need to find out how much elections actually do cost. And I would say for the academics in the room, one of the biggest questions that we continually have is how much is it to fund an election? How much do elections cost? And I think that it varies for jurisdictions and so forth, but how much do elections cost? And I'll get to that a little bit later as well. With many election offices being underfunded in staff, especially in smaller jurisdictions, officials are forced to prioritize the resources that they do have. We have understandably heard that while they do the best they can with limited funding, it's often they don't have the resources to be on what the minimum is that is required. Money first goes to securing voting systems and meeting the legal requirements of federal and state laws. And maybe you have heard this, but how much does it cost to run a good election? But what is the cost of a badly run election? The EAC's goal is to assist frontline election officials to fill the potential gaps in service, and I think that we do a pretty good job of that. And this is our focus as a national clearinghouse for 2024. The Commission has a team of former election officials as subject matter experts who have produced a number of quick start guides, training, and toolkits. These materials share best practices and considerations about various election processes and communications with the public for new and experienced officials. Over the last few years, the EAC has worked with researchers in the field of access for people who have disabilities. We've produced materials on accessibility for voter registration, in-person voting, vote by mail, language access, and ballot drop placement. These guides provide best practices and case studies from election offices around the country. Our materials are further informed by feedback and best practices from state and local election officials. And our newest training series for election officials, poll workers, and other stakeholders is how to make voting more accessible, including ways to have more accessible communications. This past summer, the EAC worked with the Rutgers University to publish a report on accessibility in the 2022 elections. We have another report coming out from Rutgers on the impact of HAVA for people who have disabilities. And as part of our clearinghouse function, the EAC also runs the Clearinghouse Awards, or Clearies. So I think that one of the things I like to do in my little role, I'm not an Oscar judge, but when jurisdictions submit the I voted stickers, it's always fun to see the creativity that's being done and how they are getting more communities involved in the creation of those stickers, from either elementary schools or high schools or to local businesses or so forth. I still tell the story about how that kid up in New York who had that really crazy New York voter, I voted sticker that they put in the New York Times, which was really fascinating to see. And then the New York Times did a small piece on me, and I send this to my family, and they're just like, oh, that's a really nice sticker. And I'm like, no, read the story about your family member next to that. So, but anyway, I like to be able to judge those stickers. So, and our Cleary's is an annual national competition where state and local election officials submit their innovative election ideas, and the nomination process is now open, and it closes March 1st. Programs are judged on creativity, sustainability, outreach, cost effectiveness, and being able to reproduce it in the results themselves. The goal of the awards is to uplift and share best practices around the country, and hopefully that when one jurisdiction can see it, they can replicate it to do it themselves. And one of the programs I'd like to highlight is the partnership between the County Audit Office and the Disability Council in Dubuque, Iowa. The strategic partnership was one of the EAC's 2022 National Clearinghouse Award winners. And during the 22 primary and general election, the Auditor's Office and Disability Council visited and assessed accessible polling places. The partnership led the county making changes to adding clip-on lights to voting booths to improve lighting for voters with visual impairments. Obviously, people are on their phones because they didn't see me do this little thing here, in front of the thing here. So the folks on Zoom probably saw it if they're not looking at their computer screens or whatever. So these sites visits also led to other adjustments like better placement of curbside voting signs, larger laminated elevator signs, and word changes. By utilizing community members' expertise, these small changes help not only voters with disabilities, but also improve the voting process overall. So overall, small changes have a big impact. So every eligible voter should have the ability to vote privately and independently. After all, at one point or another, we will all likely experience a disability. If we are lucky enough to live long enough, and you may need some sort of assistance or accommodation to cast a ballot, whether or not that's needing glasses or some sort of other assistance at the polls. But the Dubuque partnership showed how community input can help identify ways election offices can improve their service to make more eligible voters cast votes and have those votes counted accurately. Some partnerships are also the foundation for election offices to get to know their community, which contributes to more effective voter outreach efforts. Unfortunately, voter outreach and education are often among the first activities scaled down by election offices, with limited resources and other responsibilities. And voters who benefit the most from this outreach are most impacted, like those with disabilities or those who have language access needs. While the EAC has developed materials to help election offices with language access minorities, we know that there's no replacement for direct engagement with the community, as we heard in the last panel as well. A great example of this is Montgomery County, which is just a little north of here. The Montgomery County Board's Election Future Voter Initiative, which has grown and deepened its ties within the community. The board recruits students from grades 6 through 12, many of whom are bilingual, to work the polls with their family members. While Montgomery County won an EAC 2018 Clearinghouse Award, over 43,000 students have participated in this program since it started in 2004. So other opportunities, as Future Voter program demonstrates, serving as a poll worker, election judge, or observer is one of the best ways to understand the county's domestic democratic process. It's an opportunity to get involved and see up close the Herculean effort that job election officials are doing across the country. We've also heard from election offices how long-term poll workers has also served as trusted messengers in their communities. One thing that I say constantly is that if you have a problem with the way that the elections are run in this country, then you should probably serve as a poll worker to see how it works from the inside. So don't just sit on the sidelines and complain about the problems. Basically, go and serve as a poll worker and see how things are done. Or learn how serving as an election judge firsthand helps with the checks and balances in place to ensure that the integrity of the election has not been swayed by one party or another. So, as I was saying about the election officials overall, 99% of them would say this of how they are just there to call balls and strikes, and that they don't necessarily, they care who wins because most of them are elected, but for the most part, it's I would say for our folks, I don't care who wins on the federal level, but I want to make sure that the election doesn't come into question. In 2023, I had the luxury and the benefit and the honor of basically being able to go to several countries and see how their elections were run. And then the overall question that I would always get is, well, are the elections in the U.S. safe? And the answer to that is yes. They're safe, they're secure, and the results from 2020 were accurate, as if the results from 2016 were accurate. So if you want to call into question the voting machines from 2020, know that those had, for the most part, more of a secure aspect because more of those had a paper trail to be able to do audits to them and so forth. But if I'm going to call into question the results of machines from 2020, on those same machines I won on in 2016, there may be a question of that to me. So, that's my little service announcement for today, sorry. But to help promote voter education, because I see folks are starting to nod off, and I'm going to try to finish up a little quicker here. So to help promote voter education and poll worker recruitment efforts, the EAC launched 2 days of action this year. Tomorrow, January 30th, is Help America Vote Day. And on August 1st will be National Poll Worker Recruitment Day. The EAC created this suite of customizable graphics for election offices and other stakeholders to promote Help America Vote Day 2024. The new graphics are highly customizable and user-friendly, and the EAC's website has dedicated poll worker resources for election officials and the public. And so I wanted to highlight what it's called. It's Help America Vote Day, helpamericavote.gov page, which includes poll worker lookup tools, where you can find information about how to serve as a poll worker in your community. Links are provided how you can work directly with your state or local office. And the Cleary Award Program has a dedicated best practices in recruiting, retaining, and training of poll workers. So for the 2022 cycle, I also want to highlight something that I got to see firsthand. The Guam Election Commission won a Cleary Award for their partnership with the University of Guam to offer an academic credit for being in class for election administration. So if your university allows for credit to be given, I would say that looking at the Guam program would be really something of interest to take a look at. The course includes a way of working as a precinct official and election assistant at polling places. 26 students enrolled, and the Guam elections director was invited to teach the class in the fall of 23. Another EAC program I had put on your radar is a college poll worker program, the grant program. We were given $1 million in the grants for the first time since 2010 to encourage student participation as poll workers and assistants. This will help to cultivate the next generation of poll workers, which I think is a priority that the EAC should be looking at. Because I think that if you get more younger people involved in the process, it's more likely that they'll be able to follow through as they get older and bring other folks with them as well. So eligible organizations include accredited colleges, nonprofit organizations, local and state offices. And so as the process is closed and we're going to announce the winners sometime this week, I encourage all of you, if we get more money in the next funding cycle, if you're in nonprofit, a accredited college, or so forth, to apply for that money to get more people involved in the elections process. So, in conclusion, because I see that there's been a few folks to actually walk out on my talk. So, running elections is not easy, and success depends on election officials, workers, and resources available. So, I encourage engagement with voters is a critical piece of establishing election offices as a trusted source and help insulate voters against misleading narratives. I say this all the time, that since elections have been run, there's always been this misnomer or this thought of misinformation, whether or not people have put flyers up to say Democrats vote on Wednesday, Republicans vote on Thursday. That has always been there. But what's new now is that with social media, that's instantaneous and hard to refute as illegitimate means of information. So I say, go to those trusted resources. Every state has a chief election official, whether or not that's a state election director, whether or not that's a secretary of state or lieutenant governor. Go to their web pages to find out what the information is, or just try to call up what your local election official is. And as you serve as a poll worker, you'll get that information firsthand. So this outreach and education about the elections process expands trusted representatives and messengers. So this strengthens our public confidence and participation in elections. So when groups are excluded from, and someone said this earlier, so I'm just repeating what they said. When groups are excluded from power, that exclusion is only entrenched through, for example, voter disenfranchisement. Equitable inclusion as part of the representation increases trust because it demonstrates proof that our system is working. Increased participation and diversity enhances our elections, community, and democracy. With primary season already here, please remember to check your voter registration is up to date. Do not give anyone an excuse not to allow you to be able to cast your vote. Have a voting plan and consider, as I've said 3 times now, that's the key, I've said it 3 times, to be a poll worker. Lastly, we may have one or more people in our own lives that refuses to register to vote for whatever reason. Maybe you can also get this person to register to vote this year. Basically take someone else to the polls. Again, I want to thank USC and Dr. Romero for having me here today, and the many speakers and panelists who provided information to this forum. Thank you.
So it is that time of the day where we are going to soon say goodbye. And I first off want to just thank you all again for attending, for those on Zoom for sticking with us all day. It's hard to do Zoom, hard to do an all-day conference virtually, right, in any form. What I'd like to do before we leave, well, first I do want to have just a little bit of a conversation with all of you. But first, before I forget, I really want to extend a sincere thank you to Democracy Fund for sponsoring this event, for being obviously such a great partner to so many of you in the room, including also my center as well. But really making this, making sure feedback, are we good? Really making this conversation possible. I started off the morning talking about the fact that there aren't enough conversations about how to build an inclusive democracy, or just the importance of an inclusive democracy, right? And as we go into, it's always been important, but as we go into 2024, we're in, but the cycle, the election cycle, as we go forward, there haven't been and I suspect there will continue to not be very many conversations that are really focused around equity. There's all the work that everybody on the ground is doing, the amazing, right, work that is so important. But often when we have convenings, we have discussions, we bring leaders together, leaders in the democracy space. We're talking about so many other things that are so critical right now, but we're not really necessarily really keeping our eye on equity. And of course, people, as I said, also, I recognize that not everyone thinks inclusive democracy is a goal. There's many that do think it's a goal, that it's important. It's something that we need to continue to work towards and eventually, hopefully, realize. But it's not necessarily seen as a priority, right? And I think many of us know that we're not going to get there. We're not going to see that promise realized unless we do prioritize it in every single type of conversation around our democracy, elections adjacent conversations, lifting it up, prioritizing it, and bringing in the perspectives, having an inclusive table, right, in terms of conversations around this as well. So for the conversations that we had today, I just want to ask you guys a few questions. I mean, what stood out to you if we think about the first panel? Thoughts, things that might have struck you, things that you might want to carry with you as you go through the day. And of course, that first panel is really talking about the now, right? The strategies. How do we get to a multiracial democracy? What works, what doesn't work? So we had a fabulous set of panelists that really walked us through their on-the-ground experiences. What did we hear? What did you guys hear?
Well, I was a panelist, but also I just heard the theme, not just amongst our panel, but particularly the theme from our panel and then the last panel when we talked about long-term organizing. One is year-to-year, year-round organizing, and how important it is to be able to continue to do that. And the other thing that I heard a lot about was just this, opportunity to build from the ground up, and really, there's opportunities at all levels of government, particularly, but particularly at the local levels where folks can really, experience democracy for the first time and feel like they have make a difference, and then how that can then, really build their appetite for democracy after they participated at the local level. But using really all levels of the spectrum of democracy to engage our communities, not just thinking about national elections, but what's happening in your school boards and all those other really important elections.
So moving beyond the national, right, that sucks every bit of the air out of the room usually when we're having any sort of conversation around our elections. So working across levels and over time, right? So, yeah. Others? Any conversations? Yeah, Mitchell.
A common thing that I saw too, or heard too, is talking to community. Every panel we talk about the importance of talking to community. It's very easy to think what's going on until you talk to community members who actually tell you what's going on. So whether that's through talk about just general election administration, building movements, it's all about talking to community members and having them be a part of the movement. Because it has to start from the ground up. This top-down approach is never going to work. It always has to start from the ground and let the movement build up.
And for those on Zoom, that was Mattia at first and Mitchell. And Mitchell, you were talking about ground up, talking to the communities, but not talking at them, having them be a part of, right, leading and having movement work, mobilizing work really reflect where they're at, right? Yeah. Thank you. And I think Kathleen had and then I'll come to.
Thank you. Well, just to add to what other folks said, building from the ground up and talking to the community, and I kept hearing about the issues, right? The stories were about what it is that people care about in their lives, like reproductive rights and schooling and access to citizenship and so many other issues. So it wasn't necessarily about voting at the election all the time. Candidates.
Yeah. So Kathleen was lifting up the conversations we were having, the part of the conversation that was really focused on what matters to people in their lives, not necessarily the election and what candidate they want, but what are the issues that matter for them, and then connecting it, right, also to voting, yeah.
I think I leave with an interesting thought about how things should ideally work versus how they actually work. Hearing about Mr. Hicks thinking, oh, you should apply to be a poll worker, and also hearing Mitchell say that's a privilege to be a poll worker.
Yeah.
Somebody else said, in order for you to be a poll worker, you probably retire because they don't get paid really well. And so how do we ask somebody to make a living out of being a poll worker? And then the other side on disability access, thinking through how poll workers in Texas are actually afraid of helping people with disabilities because of the current SB1 policy that we have, where being able to get paid to help somebody fill out their ballot by mail is not allowed under the current law. And so how things are idealistically should work versus how they're actually happening on the ground and the disparity on that. And also thinking about, well, there's so much money available or there's opportunity, so why are we, CBOs, not allow us poll workers in the polling locations? And why are election officers pushing us out every time we take nonpartisan voters to polls, right? And so, like, I think there's still a lot of education that needs to happen with election officers back home, back where we're all coming from our own communities, because DC might have a perspective of how that should actually be working. It's not what's transpiring on the ground.
Okay. So Danita was talking, or just talked about, and correct me if I've got any of this wrong, but basically the disconnect, right, between kind of the ideal, and if I may, just not just ideal, but what people think kind of is happening, right, and should happen, and it can happen, versus kind of on the ground what the reality is, right? So using poll worker, and a lot of people, of course, agree with you, Tom, that we need more poll workers. We need to diversify our poll workers. We need more, community members. But the reality of what Mitchell was saying was, it's a privilege to be able to do it, right? And that's a real barrier. That's a real barrier. If I may, that related to that is often why, what's one of the number one kind of counters when you see really low turnout like I showed today, or lower turnout numbers like I showed today. You'll sometimes hear, right, well, it's easy to vote, right? You have the internet. I don't understand why people just don't go do it. There aren't really any barriers anymore. Thinking it's easy to vote is not, there's a disconnect between that and kind of the reality of people's lives, right? Not having access to information, right? Inequitable landscapes in terms of that, yeah. Did I leave anything? I know I left a lot out, but that was summarizing, okay. Well, what I'll say is let's lift up and talk about the funding for a moment, right? So a common theme also was the impact of insufficient funding, right? On community groups, but also I'm sorry, I'm looking at you, but I think you're the one that made the comment, Mitchell. Also on election officials, right? That so much of what we see or don't see election officials doing often can be explained or understood. May not be anything that's wrong, so to speak, but just understood if they're not outreaching to community groups or doing extensive or maybe even any sort of significant media campaign, for instance, right? Or having a difficulty in collaborating. Maybe they don't have the resources, the time, the training, the orientation to be able to do it. So recognizing that, but then also community groups, right, who maybe then are on their own in many jurisdictions also don't have, right, the sufficient funding to fight an uphill, what feels like an uphill battle, right, a steep hill to climb. Yeah.
I was just gonna add to that, an example in 2019, we started a research, multi-year research with couples around our lucha listens, and so organizers were already having community meetings out in the community,
yeah.
And so this team came and essentially transcribed all of the notes, and it was mainly around like visioning what is the Arizona economy or the people's first economy that we want to build in the state. And so usually as organizers, right, we will get a bunch of paper and start writing and then, do a call to action. But over a period of almost a year, we across the state, we held those meetings, research group was there, produced an impacted report, which helped us to get some funding. But what was our core is that from those conversations, they helped us identify themes, and then what would those themes, issue themes became policy. And so from there, actually, our People's First Economy Coalition was born, which now is introducing like proactive legislature that came from those listening sessions. That includes paid family leave, that includes lowering the voting age and other things in Arizona. And so I think to the point that it's like has to be this holistic thing where it's not just like, oh, just tell me your story and what you are struggling with.
Tell me what you're going to do with this information.
Yeah.
Yeah. So listening sessions that actually resulted in legislative action of some sort, right? Yeah. I think the other thing I'll just lift up is, we've talked about in different forms today, the long haul, the big picture. And from a research perspective, as I mentioned this morning, I showed you a couple of, a few election cycles here, right? But we know, and as I've mentioned, of course, the disparities that we see are entrenched historically, right? We could go back election cycles. The numbers would change a little bit. The gaps would narrow some elections, widen some elections, but they were always present, right? When we think about how can we change that, there's really two buckets, right, that I think of in terms of kind of actionable areas to potentially change in the long haul those disparities, right, and the underrepresentation in our electorate. So one is making it easier for people to vote. That's institutional change, right? Things like election reforms, like automatic voter registration, potentially vote centers, early day voting. People can debate, right, the merits of specific election reforms, but the idea is that you're opening up access, right? Election reform is designed to open up access, making it easier for people to vote. The other part of it is much harder. It's making people want to vote, or helping people, right, want to vote, making the connection, and not making them want to vote because they're apathetic, as I think I mentioned briefly this morning. The numbers don't have anything to do with how much communities care, right, about seeing improved quality of life in the world around them. Communities of color care deeply and are doing all sorts of everyday civic engagement activities that we don't get to measure very well as researchers, and don't often translate into voting. Voting is not actually a great measure. It's an incredibly important activity for representation and the strength of our democracy, but it's not actually a great measure for understanding the level of activity, kind of every day, people helping each other, taking actions, big or small, more almost always informal, to improve the quality of life in their communities as they define it, right? Not as researchers or civic or government leaders and so forth. So we know that people care very deeply, but often even the most active people in their communities are not, not seeing how voting is an actionable step on the issues they care about, right? And why is that? Because there's and we've talked about this right across the panels, I just want to lift it up again. The level of disconnect, right, is so high, and I think across race, ethnicity, and groups, but it is higher in communities of color. It's for historical reasons, for current barriers that are at play. And we heard today from our community leaders, right, organizations that really, if I may, so much of what you're doing is making the case for voting, right? You're supporting, you're learning, you're working with, you're lifting up voices, helping people take action on issues they care about for their community, but ultimately you're making the case. If you're doing anything electoral, you have to make the case for voting, right? Why it matters, why they should take the time, and if they vote and they don't see a change, why they should stick with it, right? And all of that. And so because of that, it just makes it really difficult, right, to make the case for voting. But when we don't see communities of color participate, or other historically underrepresented groups, young people, for instance, it is really often a reflection of just how the larger kind of societal structures that make people feel disconnected, right? When we talk about larger structural change, we didn't talk today about the way our political system is designed, right? The fact that the overwhelming majority of outreach and voter mobilization is done by candidates and campaigns. Candidates and campaigns are perhaps understandably so, but they are not trying to get every voter to vote. They are just trying to get their voters to vote, and not necessarily all of their voters. They just need just enough, right? And they're strategizing almost always. There's always good exceptions, of course, but almost always they're using some form of a likely voter modeling. They're targeting. They're trying to figure out the best bang for their buck, and they're hitting the highest propensity voters. And depending on how competitive the election is, maybe they're hitting some further down, right, in that modeling. But it's why we often see. And we have some survey data to shed light on this as well. But why we often see communities that don't show up on that likely voter model, even individuals when registered, very unlikely or much less likely to get outreach and mobilization from candidates and campaigns. And so the case for voting right is not made, at least at that level. And of course, our election officials are not responsible for actually getting turnout. Some really want to, but they're not responsible for it by and large, right? And so then we have basically an equitable outreach landscape that amazing, right, community organizations are working within, right, to try to make up the difference. And I think greater recognition, I assume everybody would agree with me, greater recognition that we start with in an equitable outreach landscape, right? And many other barriers as well, that people are kind of fighting, right, to work kind of up against that hill in that sense. We also didn't talk about, we have a single member winner take all, plurality, if I can talk, districts. And that produces things like safe seats, right? Competitiveness of election is a key predictor of how high turnout will be, at least at an aggregate level. And we have a system that also makes it hard, right, for people to see why their vote necessarily matters if they don't think it's actually going to make a difference in a race, right? And I'm just kind of touching the surface here, but from a data perspective, to really move the numbers, right, in a significant way, to kind of counter what we've seen historically, it's also conversations about larger structural change, right? That people feel disconnected because there's reasons why they feel disconnected. They're not getting it out of thin air, right? So, money and politics, fears of corruption, the decimation of our media landscape. So as I think maybe it was Mattia, we're talking, maybe it was talking about not getting information at the local level, right? And your local newspaper, but somebody else, yeah. Her mom, yeah, it's a local newspaper, right? And so you're not getting that information. Fairness of drawing of district lines, right? And again, outreach that often doesn't happen, doesn't reach everybody. If it does reach it, it can be often ineffective, insincere, right? Or just plain not enough. So we want to kind of lift up. I hear that in some of what you were talking about. I want to just kind of lift that up and just acknowledge the kind of larger structure that everybody's kind of working in. You're trying to make the case for voting within that structure, right? Yeah. And you're working with limited funds in a landscape already, right, inequitable in terms of outreach and education. So as a researcher, that's what I would expect long term in terms of significant moving of the needle. We're talking about big moving. Everybody's work obviously is critically important. Everybody has success stories to talk about. Every community, moving your individual communities is important, but at a larger level, not all of you aren't everywhere, right? And so making it easier to vote and making the case for vote, the disconnection, and the structural kind of cycle of disconnection is something that I just want to kind of maybe leave us with to think about a little bit more. I thank you so much again for being here today. And again, I hope that this conversation, you're having already, very important conversations in your communities, but just as you go about out in the world, just calling out when you don't hear, as I know many of you do already, calling out when you don't hear equity discussed, or our unrepresentative electorate discussed when we're talking about the kind of critical issues that are at play right now in 2024 under the democracy umbrella. We want to encourage more of those conversations as I started off the day. Thank you very much, and safe travels. Thank you, those on Zoom.